Hello everyone, this is Jess from the China-Europe Academy. The China-Europe Academy is a cultural exchange forum that brings together experts and scholars from China and Europe with expertise in a variety of fields. Welcome to our programme today, which will focus on Freud and China. As the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud rose to global fame and continues to attract attention today. Freud's theories and works were first introduced to China in 1913 and have had a considerable impact in China. His ideas and works are now part of cultural life in China. Collecting antiques was one of Freud's major passions. Late in life, he increasingly began to acquire Chinese pieces, adding to the ancient Egyptian, Greek and Roman objects which make up the bulk of his collection. His engagement with China also took other forms. Although he did not read widely about China, he still made ideas about Chinese language central to his understanding of the interpretation of dreams. Until now, there has been little research into Freud and China. Now, the Freud Museum in London launches a special exhibition, Freud and China, Possession and Imagination, to explore and reveal Freud's fascination with China for the first time. We are honoured to invite the curator of this exhibition, Professor Craig Clunas. He will tell us about the Chinese dimension in Freud's collection, explore the history of Freud's theories and ideas in China and their significance in modern China today, and bring us new insights into the endlessly fascinating figure of Freud. Craig Clunas is Professor Emeritus of the History of Art at the University of Oxford, where he was the first holder of the chair to specialise in the arts of China from 2007 to 2018. Much of his work concentrates on the Ming Dynasty of China, with additional interests in the art of 20th century and contemporary China. Before working at the Oxford University, he worked as a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum and taught art history at the University of Sussex and the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Now, let's please welcome Professor Craig Clunas.
Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was actually born in a small town in what is now the Czech Republic. But his family moved to Vienna, the capital of the empire, one of the great cities of Europe, when he was quite young, and he lived in Vienna all of his life, except for the very end of his life, when he was forced to leave Vienna as a refugee and come here to London and to the house that you see behind me, which he lived in for the last year of his life, from 1938 until he died late in 1939. So Freud was a doctor. I mean, he trained as a medical doctor, and his interest was always in mental health, in nervous diseases, in diseases of the nerves. And he gradually developed the technique which he called psychoanalysis, and he is the inventor of that name and that procedure, which has had an enormous impact on understandings of the mind, mental health, and also I think we have to say a very important impact on the history of culture, in that his understandings of the mind, the way the mind works, the way that childhood experiences impact on the lives we live as adults, these have been hugely influential ideas. So there's no doubt about it that whether you think Freud's ideas are correct or not, and it's important to acknowledge that there are many people who think that Freud's ideas are not correct, whether you think his ideas are correct or not, his impact on science, on medicine and culture in the 20th century was absolutely enormous.
Exactly. So let's also sort of come to the second question, is that how did Freud come to London and settle here?
Yes, well, he came as a refugee. Freud was a Jew, he was Jewish, and so when Nazi Germany annexed Austria in 1938, obviously he was immediately in danger, but he was also in danger because of his ideas, because the psychotherapy, the ideas of psychotherapy were absolutely forbidden by the Nazis. So as a Jew and as the inventor of psychoanalysis, Freud was doubly at risk. he was, unlike many other Jewish Austrians, he was in fact able to leave Austria. A lot of pressure was put on the government, embassies worked on his behalf, and so he and his immediate family, his wife, his daughter, were able to come to England, where he already had family. Freud had relatives in England. One of his sons had lived in England for many years, so he had relatives in England. Some members of the family, Freud's sisters, for example, were all left behind in Austria, and they were all murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust, in the Second World War. So Freud came to Britain as a refugee and lived here in this house for the last year of his life. He was already a very unwell man when he came here. He was very elderly. He was in his early 80s. He had suffered from cancer of the jaw, so he didn't go out much. He spent really all of his time in this house, in this garden we're sitting in. He spent a lot of time sitting in the garden, and his study immediately behind us had French windows which came straight out into the garden, so he was able to enjoy the fresh air. But he spent really all his time here. He didn't go out.
This is the special exhibition Freud and China, Possession and Imagination in Freud Museum in London. It's an intriguing opportunity to examine some of the ways in which Sigmund Freud's occasionally puzzling engagement with ideas about China affected his thought.
I think one of the interesting things is that this is simply an aspect of Freud's life that hasn't been looked at in such detail before. Obviously, there's been a great deal of study of Freud, all aspects of his life and thought. And there's been a lot of attention to Freud's collection of antiquities, and people have, I think, quite correctly seen Freud's collection of antiquities as telling us something about the man, about his ideas, but the Chinese part of it has been, if not exactly overlooked, it really hasn't been discussed very much by comparison with the much larger number of Greek and Roman and Egyptian antiquities that Freud owned, but particularly when you think about the fact that Freud seems to have developed his interest in Chinese antiquities later in his life, in the last decade of his life, the 1930s. It just seemed to me that it was worth, for a short period, taking those Chinese objects out of their usual context. They're usually spread about in the collection as Freud had them, bringing them all together and just pausing for a moment to think, what does this mean? What does this tell us? What does this grouping of Chinese things that he owned show us about Freud the man, Freud the thinker, and the way in which he engaged with objects and with the wider world? Objects that Freud cared about particularly, one has to focus on the small jade screen that stood right in the middle of Freud's desk. So this is a small jade table screen, probably relatively new when Freud acquired it, and we don't know when he bought it. That's one of the things about most of the antiquities, that we know when he bought them, but not who he bought them from or how much he paid from them. The thing that makes this, I think, particularly significant is that it sat right in the middle of Freud's desk, both in Vienna and here in London. In 1938, when the Nazis took over Austria, Freud was very anxious, understandably, to get out of the country, to get his family out of the country, but he was also anxious to get his collection out. And it was by no means certain that he would be able to do this. Jews who were emigrating, who were able to emigrate, were by and large not able to take their possessions with them. They left as refugees. So it seemed possible to Freud that he might be going to lose the entire collection. However, he had a friend of his, her name was Princess Marie Bonaparte. She was herself a psychoanalyst, she'd been a patient of Freud's, and she was a very grand lady. She was very well connected to foreign embassies, to the Greek embassy, to the American embassy. And Marie Bonaparte smuggled out of Freud's apartment in Vienna 2 objects. She put them in her handbag, we believe, and took them out with her. One of those objects is a small bronze figure of the Greek goddess Athena, and it's kind of easy to understand why that meant a great deal to Freud, she's the goddess of wisdom, of knowledge, of ideas and the intellect. But the second object that Marie Bonaparte took with her was this small Chinese screen, which I'm going to pick up very carefully now. And this screen smuggled out at the point when Freud thought that he might be about to lose absolutely everything. So if we imagine that the Nazis had confiscated his collection would have been reduced to two pieces, to the little bronze Greek figure and to this jade screen. So although we don't exactly know why it mattered so much to Freud, we, I think, are entitled to say that it mattered quite a lot to him. I mean, obviously there are practicalities to this. She wasn't going to be able to smuggle some of the larger things like this Buddha figure or so on. She wasn't going to be able to smuggle those out of the apartment in her handbag. And it might just also have been familiarity, that this is in the center of Freud's desk. But that then begs the question, why is this in the center of Freud's desk? So I think we are entitled to think that it's an object that was particularly important to Freud, that mattered to him a lot. And it's an example of the jade objects which he had. He was very fond of jade, and quite different, I think, from the larger kinds of antiquities, the Tang-style figures and Buddhist figures that he acquired in the last decade of his life. So that if he wrote, wrote down things about them, but the catalogue, that doesn't exist. I mean, obviously he left Austria. He was a refugee. He had to flee. He had to leave lots of stuff behind. So that doesn't survive. But we know from the diary where he writes things like Tang figure that he must have thought these things, some of these things were Tang. Now, I mean, it's important to say a large proportion of Freud's Chinese antiquities are not genuine, they're fakes. They're modern objects that are not as old as he thought they were. And I don't think there's any question of the dealers in Vienna that he bought these things from trying to deliberately defraud him. I think it's just that the standard of knowledge, the standard of scholarship was quite low at the time. But so, for example, this figure here, so we do know what, so Freud calls this, in his diary he writes, large Quanon bought. Now Quanon is the Japanese for Guanyin, right? So we know that Freud thought, but this is not Guanyin, because it's sitting on a lion. This is Puxian. It's a different, it's not, so, Freud's level of knowledge about these things wasn't terrifically high. He wasn't a great kind of scholar of these things. Sometimes the diary Freud's diary is very brief, but he records buying a Tang figure, and that may have been one of the first of the Tang style things that he bought. And it could be this one, we're not sure, but it could be this one. So this might be one of the first Chinese antiquities that he bought in 1930, when he began to be interested in these things. And this is a slightly speculative idea, but one of the things that struck me is that most of Freud's Tang-style figures are of women. I mean, there's horses and camels, but the human figures, they're mostly women, or they are figures like this Buddha figure, or these priests, sort of androgynous figures. Where is masculinity? Now this figure, and this is a common style of Tang figure, that is, it shows a groom, somebody looking after horses, who comes from Western Asia, from what is now Iran or so on. You have the big beard, you have the very large nose. This is the Tang idea of Xiyu, the Western regions. So this is a kind of idea of that. But, and you know, you might think I've gone crazy when I say this, but one of the things that struck me is, you know, when we put it in the case, Brian and I stood and looked at it and we both thought, it looks like Freud. It looks like Freud himself. It looks like a self-portrait. You know, we looked over at the portrait, you know, the photographs of Freud, the beard, the nose, and we know that Freud. So, for example, he once made a joke about one of the Greek or Roman antiquities dancer. He said to a friend of his, you know, it's got a nice Jewish face, right? You know, it's got a nice Jewish face. So did Freud think this had a nice Jewish face as well? You know, that's very speculative stuff. But it is striking that it's a very kind of explicitly masculine figure, explicitly male figure, and it's almost the only one that you could say that of. It's certainly the only bearded figure. It's certainly the only one with a beard, which of course Freud himself always wore a beard all his life, from when he was a young man till his death. So it's quite different from these female figures. You know, a number of us working on this exhibition, particularly a colleague at the Freud Museum, Emilia Raczkowska. Emilia, this panel was written by Emilia, thinking about Freud and the feminine. Freud changed his ideas about women, about female sexuality late in his life. He was thinking about these ideas late in his life, particularly because by late on in Freud's life there were a number of important female psychoanalysts. That was his daughter, Anna, who herself, of course, was one of the most important female psychoanalysts. Marie Bonaparte, who is the lady who smuggled the jade screen out of the apartment. A Dutch psychoanalyst called Jean Lampel de Groot, who was a great friend of his. So he's interacting a lot with women, with female intellectuals in the last part of his life. And the other thing to think about is that Freud, in the last decade of his life, lost his mother. Freud is one of these people Freud's mother lived a very long time, so he himself was an old man by the time she died. Now, people who've studied Freud's collecting have all along made the point that he started collecting antiquities in the 1890s when his father died, and they've associated his collecting with the act of mourning, with the act of commemoration of the dead. Most of these objects, and a large part of the objects in his collection, are to do with burial. They are to do with death. The Greek, the Roman ones, that's true of the Chinese ones as well. So it's kind of intriguing. Again, we don't know this exactly, but it's sort of intriguing that it's when his mother dies that he starts to turn towards the collecting of Chinese things, and that within those Chinese things, one of the dominant themes is the female figure, is women. And we know he gave Chinese objects to his daughter Anna as presents. So there are, for people who are interested in Freud's thought and the development of Freud's thought, it seems to me that this Chinese and feminine aspect in the last decade of his life is at least worth considering. Freud had a very extensive, large library about art and archaeology, but he had almost nothing about China in that library. There are lots of things being published in European languages at this time, and so there are lots of books that Freud could have owned if he'd wanted to. So I think, again, we have to see this as almost a deliberate choice on Freud's part to not know too much about China. He owned this very small book called, the German title is Chinesische Kunst, which just means Chinese art, by Ludwig Bachhofer, a sort of small introductory volume. And he owned a travel book about China in German. He owned a big English volume about early Chinese jades, but I think that that's a book that he was probably given after he came to England by friends who knew that he was interested in this. And he owned this volume, a copy of this volume of translations into German of Chinese poetry by the poet Max Fleischer. But this isn't Freud's own copy of that book, because we know that this is one of the many books that Freud disposed of before he left Vienna. He didn't bring his whole library. So again, I think that tells us something about, you know, he's really just not that, he's not interested in reading as much as he can about China. He deliberately chooses to be uninformed. And that seems to me to be a rather Freudian idea. So one aspect of Freud's life which has a perhaps rather distant Chinese connection is his pets. And again, this is part of Freud's later life. So from the late 1920s right through into his death, Freud kept pet dogs. He had a series of dogs. And although at least one of them was an Alsatian, most of Freud's dogs are of the breed that is known in both English and German as chows. And these dogs were seen by European collectors, by European owners, as having come from China, as having a very kind of Chinese connection. They were seen as a specifically Chinese breed. So there's these there are these large fluffy dogs. Here's Freud with one of them. And it's again, I think, slightly significant that, and lots of owners of these dogs did this, Freud gave them names which sounded Chinese to the European ear. So his dogs had names like Yo Fi or Lun, which are not real Chinese names, or you know, they sound, but to a European, these sound like they might be Chinese names. And giving the dogs Chinese names and very much associating them with China, and is I think slightly significant. So here's one of the when Freud was in Vienna after the Germans had taken over Vienna, and he's got this very anxious wait to see if he's going to get out of the country. Obviously very nervous, very difficult, very stressful time, very hard to work. What did he do to kind of relax? Well, he and Anna, his daughter, translated into German a book about chows by Marie Bonaparte. Marie Bonaparte, his friend, the psychoanalyst who had smuggled the jade thing. So Marie Bonaparte had actually given him his first chow, and she kept chows, and she had a dog called Topsy. And the dog, she wrote a book about the dog. Freud, the book is sort of slightly crazy. It's slightly kind of, you know, fantastical about this dog and its life. Freud, and she wrote it in French. And Freud and Anna, in order to have something to do, you know, something to occupy their mind while they're stressed out of their mind, waiting to see if they're going to be able to get out of Vienna, they sat down and they translated this book from the French into German, and it was actually published in German by a German language publisher in the Netherlands. And then it was translated into English, and this is a copy of the English translation of this. And there's a picture here of Marie Bonaparte with one of her chows, with Topsy. So this is Marie with Topsy, and this is the book that Freud translated. So it's almost one of his last publications, is this translation of this rather loopy book about Marie Bonaparte's pet dog. So, you know, these pets played a major part in his emotional life. They tended not to live very long, these dogs. They're not a very long-lived breed. So his diary records the death of several of these dogs, which were, you know, big emotional moments for him, especially as he knew he was very ill, he knew he was old, he's kind of contemplating death himself. And the dogs were a very important part of his emotional life. belonged to Anna Freud. She had several pieces of jade jewellery. This jade necklace here is also hers, and there's a photograph of her actually wearing the necklace. We don't have a photograph of her wearing the brooch, but she certainly did wear this brooch. It was one of her own favourite pieces of jewellery, and almost certainly a gift to her from her father. He gave her numerous pieces of jewellery on her birthday and on other occasions. And it seemed like a good object to focus on the poster for the exhibition, because in a way, again, from a European point of view, it's like super Chinese. It's like super Chinese. It's made of jade and it's got dragons on it. So these are both things that the European mind associates very much with China. So to Freud and to Anna and to people, friends and family who saw her wearing this brooch, this thing would immediately speak out as being a Chinese object. And so there's a sort of interesting tension, I think, running throughout the exhibition between objects that proclaim themselves to be Chinese and speak very clearly and very loudly about their Chineseness, but at the same time there is a silence, which is Freud's unwillingness to write or to say very much about his Chinese objects, and his unwillingness to spend a great deal of time learning about them. So there's an importance and a silence, but if Freud teaches us anything, it is that silences are often just as what we don't say is as important as what we do say. If Europeans in Freud's time think what stands for China, it would be jade and it would be dragons. And I mean, it still is. I mean, you think of the number of books about China, you know, if some Western political scientist writes a book about China, what picture goes on the cover? It's usually a picture of a dragon, isn't it? You know, so in the European mind, kind of dragons, China, and indeed these are the only dragons. I don't think Freud's Chinese. Well, some of the little jades perhaps are dragons, but so I think Freud did know. I mean, obviously he doesn't have a Chinese understanding of what jade means, but the idea that jade is A, very important, and B, very Chinese, that he would get, because that's just part of educated European common sense at that period. It's not, you don't have to be a specialist in Chinese art to know, you know, where you know, if you went out in the street and said to people, you know, what country do you associate with jade? They're going to say China. Right in the middle of his desk. And in fact, the way they're arranged here is the way they would be arranged on the desk, but with the Greek, the little bronze Athena figure kind of in between them. Quite what is this? So it's a jade figure of a man, a bearded man. You can actually see the head here blown up, kind of very large. So, you know, if we're thinking about masculine figures and self-portraits of Freud, this is perhaps almost like another one. I don't think it's a mythological figure. I don't think it's a deity. I think it's a human being, a scholar. I suspect that it's part of something larger, so I suspect that it's a figure possibly part of a large folding screen with jade, lots of jade figures, and it's been mounted on this wooden stand, this little wooden screen, really kind of in the art trade, you know, at some point in order to sell it. I've always thought it's a particularly kind of nice piece of carving. Perhaps, you know, one of the other jade pieces that's particularly significant is this little figure of a frog, because we know that Freud had a regular Wednesday evening meeting in his consulting room right at the beginning of psychoanalysis, when there are really only him and maybe half a dozen other people who are interested. They're all men, they're all doctors, and they would meet once a week to talk about Freud's ideas and new ideas about the mind and new ideas about psychoanalysis. And one of the men who was part of that group mentions that this little jade frog was always in the middle of the table, you know, so you have to imagine all these men, they're sitting around, they're probably all smoking, they all smoked at this time, they all smoked cigars. Freud was a heavy smoker himself. So they're all kind of sitting around smoking and talking about psychoanalysis. And this little figure is sitting in the middle of the table. And one of that group, he says, it was a sort of symbol of the group, you know, it was always there. It was the kind of thing that that they all noticed when they came together.
Really? So was this the only thing sitting on the table?
It's on a sort of meeting, you know, if you have to imagine a kind of big table and they're all kind of sitting around smoking like crazy. And and he mentions this little frog sitting in the middle of the table. I think it's important to understand that the collection is part of the collection of antiquities is part of Freud's working life. So and not part of his everyday life. So we have quite a good sense of where things were in his apartment in Vienna, because there was a photographic record made of his apartment just before he left it. All of the collection, the Greek things, the Egyptian things, the Chinese things, they're concentrated in Freud's study, where he wrote his books, and in his consulting room where he saw his patients. They're not anywhere else in the apartment. So the dining room, the bedroom, the living room where he sat in the evening reading the papers, where his wife lived, where his children lived, has no objects. There's no Chinese things there. There's no Greek things or Egyptian things there either. The collection of antiquities is in Freud's working space. It's his professional space. It's not in his everyday living space. And that's why so many people have made the point that Freud's collection is part of his intellectual life, his professional life, his psychoanalytic life. It's not part of his, these are not decorations. They're not just things he bought to kind of put around the house for ornaments. They're things that formed part of his mind. Exactly.
We know that this exhibition is about Freud and China. So for now, what do we know about Freud's books and theories in China? For example, how did his theories were introduced and accepted in China?
Well, Freud was a globally famous figure by the early 20th century. And so his fame in the teens and the 19-teens, the 1920s, those are really the decades when his fame spreads all over the world. Those are the decades in which he becomes famous in Britain and also famous in China. So we know, scholars have identified the first time that Chinese periodicals are talking about Freud and his ideas is 1913. So that's very, very early after the end of the Qing dynasty, when the Republic of China is created. And his work starts to be discussed in the teens, it starts to be translated, some of his books start to be translated. So his ideas start to be part of the new culture movement, the kind of ferment of ideas in the Republican period, when Chinese intellectuals and indeed broader Chinese audiences are getting interested in all kinds of new ideas. But I think one of the things that strikes me is that, you know, these were new ideas in China, but they were new ideas everywhere. It's not that these were well-established ideas in the rest of the world and then they come to China. It's different from some other kinds of ideas. These are new ideas that Chinese intellectuals are latching on to very much as they are spreading round the world.
Exactly. And you mentioned that it has something to do with the new culture movement. So is his theory became popular also related to what is happening at the time in China?
Absolutely. I mean, the new culture movement, the teens, the early 20s, this is a period of enormous curiosity on the part of Chinese intellectuals. There's a lot of things being translated, there's a lot of reading and discussing going on. I mean, it's kind of interesting that one of the ways in which Freud's ideas came to China was in the course of a lecture tour by the British philosopher Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell came to Peking University in 1920 and he gave a series of lectures. Now Bertrand Russell was an opponent of Freud's. He didn't think Freud's ideas were right, and he talked about Freud's ideas in order to criticize them, but this would have made them available to Chinese intellectuals who thought, oh well, this sounds interesting, maybe I'll investigate that more. So yes, it's very much part of that ferment of ideas which goes under the name of the new culture movement. And for example, so if we think of somebody like Lu Xun, who, you know, one of the most famous figures of the new culture movement, we know that Lu Xun had some of the works, translated works of Freud, in his library. He might have read them also in Japanese translations, because Freud's works are being translated into Japanese, and for intellectuals like Lu Xun, who are very kind of connected to intellectual life in Tokyo at that period, they might well have read him in Japanese translation even before his works are translated into Chinese.
So speaking of translation, are there any Chinese publications that has significance in terms of like the translated publications of Freud's work?
Yeah, so
that has significance.
So as well as journal articles, essays that discuss his work does start to be translated in the 1920s and into the early 1930s. So it's being translated into lots of languages at this point. Freud wrote in German, of course, so it's in the teens and 20s that his work is first being translated into English. So it's being translated into Chinese more or less at the same period that it's being translated into English. And indeed, we know that some of the first translations of Freud's work into Chinese are not made from the original German, they're made from English translations, so it's translated twice, if you like. But at least one of his works, so he wrote an autobiography in the 1920s, and that's translated directly from the German into Chinese by the Chinese philosopher Zhang Shizhao, who was very kind of interested in his ideas, although skeptical about them. I think the translation of Freud's work doesn't mean that everybody kind of thought he was absolutely right, but they thought this is interesting and we want to know more about it. And in the museum here, they have one copy in Chinese, one book in Chinese of one of Freud's works called his Introductory Lectures in Psychoanalysis. And these are a series of lectures which he gave in 1915, 1916. And they were translated into Chinese in 1933, and a copy was sent from Shanghai. This was published in Shanghai and sent from Shanghai to Freud. And Freud records in his diary in 1934, he just says Chinese lectures. So this is the date when he receives the copy of the Chinese lectures, which is on display in the museum now.
So that's the Introductory of Psychoanalysis.
Introductory Lectures on Psychoanalysis, which is one of Freud's most widely read works, because it's a series of lectures where he tried to explain his ideas to a general audience. Lots of Freud's ideas are very technical, they're meant for other specialists, they're not very easy to understand or easy to read. But the introductory lectures, he deliberately designed them to explain his ideas to a wider audience. So they're kind of an important work, and I suspect they're probably one of the works by Freud that were more widely read in China. They're published by the Commercial Press, is a very kind of major Shanghai publishing house, and were probably quite widely distributed.
Yeah, and also speaking of his idea, there is a book you mentioned, is called Psychoanalysis, a brief account of Freudian theory, translated by Zhao Yan.
Yeah.
And at the same period of time, a lot of his ideas, like the official translations, were just confirmed, such as complex, depression, and even his name. So we got like several translations.
Yeah. I mean, of course, one of the problems that everybody in the world has, Freud writes in German, so this would be true in English as well. There's a lot of debate among people who are interested in Freud's ideas outside the German world, speaking well, as to how to translate Freud's ideas, because Freud introduces a lot of new words. He kind of makes a lot of new words, and exactly how to translate those into another language is always going to be a difficulty. So there's a big difficulty in English, and to begin with, these translations are kind of unstable and people use different terms, and then they kind of settle on them. So this happens in the 1920s and 30s in Chinese. Terms like, you know, complex, and the Freud's ideas about the different kind of levels of the brain, the ego, the id, the ego, the superego. As you mentioned, the characters for Freud's name, to begin with, you know, a whole range of different characters are used to transliterate, you know, Freud, but then they kind of settle on, and those are the translation that gets standardly used now when people talk about Freud in Chinese, or indeed in any other language. But Freud, it's important to remember, all of his works were originally written in German, so if you're reading him in English, you're reading a translation, as much as if you're reading him in Chinese, you're reading a translation.
Yeah. But Freud, he did knows English, right? Because he was in letter with Chinese scholar called Zhang Shizhao.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Freud was a great lover of England and its culture, even though he'd visited England as a young man in the 19th century, and as I say, he had relatives in England. He liked English literature, he read English literature, and his knowledge of the English language was quite good. One of the most poignant things, I think, is the only recording that survives of Freud's voice speaking is him speaking in English. When he came to this house in 1938, the BBC came here and made a recording of Freud speaking. And that's the only recording that survives of what Freud sounded like. We don't know what he sounded like speaking in his own native German. He will have had a Vienna and Austrian accent, but nobody has ever heard Freud's voice in German. We only hear his voice, we only now have his voice in English. So he was very interested in England and English things, and his correspondence that you mentioned with Zhang Shizhao is they exchanged letters in English. Zhang Shizhao had studied in England, he'd studied in Scotland actually. He was a graduate of the University of Aberdeen, which is my hometown. Zhang Shizhao studied at Aberdeen University, and so Zhang Shizhao had written Freud a letter because Zhang Shizhao had translated Freud's autobiography, and he'd read the introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, and he read in the introductory lectures something that Freud says about the Chinese language, which he thought, this just isn't right. So he wrote to Freud about this and said, well, where did you get this idea? And Freud wrote back to him, and so then their correspondence was in English.
So speaking of Zhang Shizhao, speaking of his connections with Chinese scholars, did Chinese or Chinese culture have any impact on his studies, especially, you know, considering his application of Chinese linguistics into his dream interpretation?
Yeah. He doesn't seem to have been very kind of widely read. I think one of the important things in understanding Freud is that Freud is very much a man of the 19th century. He's born in 1856. He's already by the time the Qing dynasty comes to an end, you know, he's already he's in his 60s, you know, he's in his 60s, he's quite advanced in age, and his ideas about China, I think, were very much formed in the 19th century. They're not hostile ideas, but they're you know, China for him is remote, is distant. It's not, he doesn't see it as something that kind of matters to him personally. His education was all about the European tradition, the European classical tradition, Greek and Latin literature, German literature, obviously kind of very important to him. And then he's trained as a scientist, as a doctor. So he doesn't think a great deal about China, I think. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have these kind of odd ideas. So for example, you know, there's two moments in the introductory lectures, or actually there's more than two, but there's a couple of moments in the introductory lectures when he mentions China. So one is when he's trying to explain the difference between a delusion and a dream. And he says, well, a delusion is kind of straightforward. Somebody just says something that isn't true. And the example he gives is, he says, so if a patient says to me, I am the Emperor of China, then they clearly have a delusion. You know, the gods are not the Emperor of China. He says, but that's very straightforward. A dream is much harder to interpret. And then he makes this kind of rather odd statement, and this is what Zhang Shizhao was interested in, where he says that, well, The interpreting dreams and interpretation of dreams is sort of central to Freud's ideas, that dreams are suppressed wishes, or things that we're not able to admit to ourselves in our waking life. And he says, well, the Chinese language, he says, is very indeterminate. It all depends on context. And that's the same with dreams. So he didn't believe. So for example, he didn't believe that the things that people happen in their dreams all mean the same for the same person. It means different things for different people. So, you know, if I dream about a tree and you dream about a tree, it doesn't necessarily have the same meaning for both of us, because it very depends on the context of our lives, on what happened to us in our childhoods and all of those kind of things. He uses Chinese, which he sees as being kind of indeterminate and context specific, as an analogy for dreams. And this is what Zhang Shizhao said, you know, where did you get this idea? Because, I mean, of course, the Chinese language is no more vague or indeterminate than any other language. It might work in slightly different ways from an Indo-European language like German or English, but it doesn't mean that it's vague or indeterminate. It works in a different way. And Zhang Shizhao wrote to Freud and said, where did you get this idea? And Freud said, well, I got this from the Encyclopedia Britannica. And you know, we might think that, you know, Encyclopedia Britannica, it's a bit like saying I looked it up on Wikipedia, or I looked, you know, Baidu, but it isn't that. The Encyclopedia Britannica was a very kind of serious and scholarly reference book, and the entry in the Chinese language was written by a man called Herbert Giles, sorry, who was professor of Chinese at Cambridge University and was a great kind of sinologist of the 19th century. And that's where Freud got it from. There is an issue, of course, where did Freud first get the idea? Because I don't believe that Freud sat down and read the encyclopedia, because nobody sits down and reads an encyclopedia. So where did he first pick up this idea about the indeterminacy, the vagueness of Chinese? And that needs further research, I think. Somebody needs to kind of think about that a bit more. So he mentions that. He mentions the kind of Emperor of China thing. He talks at one point in the introductory lectures about foot binding. But I think it's probably fair to say that, particularly by comparison with Carl Jung, who is the other great foundational figure of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, Freud wasn't greatly interested in Chinese thought and Chinese ideas, and we don't have any evidence that he made any effort to understand them, to read about this material. That doesn't seem to have been part of his mental life.
So you mentioned Carl Jung, so I think that's just quite interesting that, you know, the two great figures, their relationship, and we know that Carl Jung is I wouldn't say a big fan, but he does know a lot about Chinese, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah. I mean, yeah. So Jung and Freud had been great friends and great collaborators, and Freud had certainly hoped that Jung would be his successor as the leader of the psychoanalytic movement. But they had a huge kind of break, big intellectual falling out. I mean, I think it's fair to say that they became enemies. They never wrote to one another. They had written to one another. They never wrote. They never spoke. It's after the break with Freud that Jung becomes particularly interested in China, and he becomes particularly interested in China through his friendship with a man called Richard Wilhelm. Wilhelm had been a missionary in China, in Shandong province, and he had translated Chinese classics, and it was through Wilhelm that Jung became particularly interested in Chinese thought, Chinese philosophy, the Chinese classics, and in particularly in the I Ching. He became particularly interested in the I Ching as forms of thought that he called synchronicity, that is, forms of connection between ideas that aren't about cause and effect, but are about synchronicity, things happening at the same time. Now, I mean, I think it's possible that one of the reasons Freud steers clear of Chinese thought, and indeed Asian thought, well, because he wasn't particularly interested in, for example, Indian philosophy. After the First World War, lots of European intellectuals get particularly interested in Asian thought. You know, the First World War is this huge calamity for mankind, millions of people are killed, and there's a great kind of crisis within European thought. And there's a sort of search for alternative sources of ideas for how to live, how to organize the world. So there's a great deal of interest on the part of many intellectuals in Indian thought, in Islamic thought, in Chinese thought. Buddhism, for example, starts to be of interest in Europe at this period. Jung is very much part of that openness to Asian thought. Freud stays away from the wisdom of the East because of its association with his great enemy, Jung. But then, of course, you have this alternative position whereby Freud is actually collecting Chinese things and bringing Chinese objects into his collection, which Jung didn't do. Jung's interested in ideas and not things. Freud is interested in things and not the ideas. So there's a kind of interesting symmetry between these two thinkers who had been such great friends and were now such great enemies.
What do Chinese traditional worldviews and psychoanalysis, if there's any, have in common?
Well, this is obviously a very, very kind of big and very, very broad topic, and I think you would get different answers from different people. I would start by saying that perhaps we shouldn't think that there's such a thing as one thing called the traditional Chinese worldview. The Chinese intellectual and cultural tradition is huge, it's very vast, it's very long, and it seems to me it's very diverse. You know, it contains lots of different things. So it's perfectly possible, if you want to make connections between psychoanalytic ideas and aspects of the Chinese cultural tradition. But it's also possible, and some people have done that, and there are people today in China and elsewhere who are interested in making those connections. But it also seems to me that it's perfectly possible to say, no, these two things have nothing in common. They're completely diametrically opposed. You know, Chinese ideas and psychoanalysis have nothing to say to one another. And it's also possible to take a position which is somewhere in between, to say, well, you know, there are possible kind of connections.
Freud's philosophy theories provides one an opportunity to look into oneself very closely and deeply, right? His theory talking about ID, ego, and superego. So, and also we know that his theory became sort of popular once in China, like, you know, after the new culture movement. So, did Freud's theory of focusing on oneself have any like subtle connections, or is it fair to say that Freud's
I think the Freudian ideas, I mean, ideas about the value of the individual are very much part of 20th century thought, or parts of 20th century thought that are not connected to Freud as well. Freud's impact on Chinese literature is stronger than his impact on the visual arts. It's writers, particularly writers of fiction, who are the people who are using Freudian ideas and who are perhaps controversially using what you might call a general understanding of Freud as putting sexuality and sex at the heart of kind of human existence and what it means to be human. So you know, it's true to say, and this is a global thing in the 1920s and 1930s, that part of people's fascination with Freud is that he is seen as the man who put sex at the center of everything. And people are fascinated because, I mean, Freud is himself, you know, the least the least sexy man in the world. You know, he's old, he's very scholarly, he's very dignified. You know, he's very kind of, you know, he's not a sort of wild guy at all. And his actual life is very, very respectable and ordinary and calm and so on. But his writings seem to say, and I think it's important to think that, you know, and this is true in China, it's true in Britain, it's true all over the world, that people have an idea of Freud which is separate from what he himself necessarily wrote. So certainly writers in China in the 20s and 30s who are exploring new themes of sexuality and sensuality and desire, themes that had not been part of the literary tradition. And remember, these hadn't been part of the literary tradition in England either. You know, 19th century, if you think of Dickens, you know, there's not a lot of sex in Dickens. So this is also part of a kind of change in global understandings of what it means to be human, of which Freud is a very important part, but he's not the only or the single determinant of these kind of changes that are going on in culture. He's a part of those changes, but he's not the only thing that's making these changes happen. That's the way I would put it anyway.
On behalf of the China-Europe Academy, thank you all for your time. Please subscribe to our channel, China-Europe Academy, where you can watch a series of talks about cultural exchange between West and East. See you next time.